First contact, Scene 1, Departure. The launch window opened at 4:17 Universal Time coordinated, but none of them slept. Earth hung below the platform like something already distant, its blues and whites muted by the reinforced glass of the observation corridor. Clayton stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the planet as if committing it to memory, not because he thought he'd never see it again, but because he wasn't sure it would ever feel like home once he left. He traced coastlines, cloud formations, familiar cities, and the faint curve of the oceans. Each detail seemed simultaneously intimate and impossibly remote. Around him, the rest of the crew moved quietly, voices low. Footsteps deliberate. 12 people. That was all. 12 to carry the weight of a planet-sized ambition. They had trained together for nearly 3 years, rotating through deserts, ice fields, underwater habitats, and sealed simulations that tried, never successfully, to replicate the psychological pressure of isolation. They knew each other's habits, strengths, and irritations. They knew who snored, who paced when stressed, who went quiet instead. What they didn't know was what a year on Mars would do to them. Captain Rowan Pierce broke the silence first. Final checks start at 10. His voice was calm, practiced, steady in a way that made people listen without feeling ordered. Pierce had been chosen less for technical brilliance than for temperament. You didn't lead a mission like this by being the smartest person in the room. You led it by keeping everyone else from unraveling. Clayton turned as Mira Kovacs stepped up beside him. She followed his gaze down toward Earth, arms folded tightly across her chest. "Hard not to feel like we're doing something irreversible," she said. Clayton exhaled slowly. "That's because we are." Mira smiled faintly. "You always say the comforting thing." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that didn't need anything added to it. Then the corridor lights shifted. Artificial gravity ring at partial spin. Cargo modules are secure. Cryonaut required. The transit was long but manageable. Marcus Lynn's voice came through the internal channel. "Communications uplink stable. Delay will increase progressively after separation." Tamsin O'Connell added, "Medical systems green. Everyone remembers hydration protocols." "You will forget." "I will remind you." A few muted chuckles followed. Tension eased, just slightly. The countdown began. At 0, the engines ignited with a force that pressed Clayton into his seat, breath stolen from his lungs as Earth's gravity fought to keep what it had claimed. Vibration tore through the hull, a deep, sustained roar that drowned out thought. And then, release. Weightlessness arrived not gently, but suddenly, like a rule being lifted. Someone laughed. Someone else swore. Clayton closed his eyes for just a second. Earth fell away. The journey took months, but it did not blur together the way people expected. Time stretched and compressed in strange ways. Days were structured carefully: work rotations, maintenance drills, physical conditioning, psychological evaluations disguised as casual check-ins. They prepared for Mars long before they saw it. Dr. Lena Okoye led atmospheric briefings that walked them through every failure scenario imaginable. Insufficient pressure. Toxic particulates. Unstable temperature swings. The models were promising. But Mars was still Mars, thin, hostile, indifferent. Jonah Reeves and Viktor Petrov spent hours running simulations on structural assembly, rehearsing the deployment of habitat modules and pressure locks. The colony would begin small: 1 primary dome, 2 auxiliary units, power arrays, oxygen processors, and soil labs. Mira worked closely with Noor Al-Sayed on vegetation planning. Algae first. Lichens. Modified crops designed to survive in regolith enriched artificially. It would be slow. Everything about Mars was slow. Clayton's role cut across systems. Life support integration, environmental stability, redundancy planning. He lived in the margins between disciplines, making sure one failure didn't cascade into 10. It suited him. He had always been better at holding things together than building them from scratch. At night, or what passed for night, He often floated near the observation window, watching Mars grow from a rust-colored point into something textured and real. A world waiting to be changed, landing day came with no ceremony. The atmosphere was too thin for drama. The descent was controlled, procedural, quiet. Dust plumed beneath the landing struts as Astrias settled onto Martian soil for the first time, the sound transmitted through sensors rather than ears. "Touchdown confirmed," Marcus said. No one cheered. They just sat there for a moment, absorbing the fact that they were no longer visitors. They were residents now. The first weeks were brutal. Everything took longer than planned. Equipment behaved differently under Mars gravity. Dust infiltrated seals despite every precaution. Power output fluctuated unpredictably. They worked in pairs whenever they went outside. Buddy system, no exceptions. Caleb Wright enforced it with almost religious intensity. EVA was unforgiving. A single mistake could kill you slowly enough to regret it. Clayton was usually paired with Elias Moreno. They moved well together, efficient, quiet, focused. They installed oxygen processors, calibrated airflow regulators, and monitored pressure stability. Inside the habitat, routines formed. Meals were communal, functional rather than social. Conversations drifted from technical issues to fragments of Earth life they hadn't realized they missed until they were gone. Rain. Trees. The sound of cities at night. Captain Pierce kept meetings short. Problems were addressed directly. No one was allowed to spiral. A year passed. Mars did not become friendly, but it became familiar. Vegetation trials showed early promise. Oxygen levels increased incrementally within controlled zones. Soil composition stabilized where they intervened carefully. They were not terraforming Mars yet, not really. They were preparing it. Teaching it, slowly, how to tolerate human presence. And through it all, they never suspected they were not alone. By the end of the first year, Clayton could step outside the habitat and feel something close to comfort in the routines. Check seals. Confirm pressure. Sync comms. Move with purpose. Mars remained silent. 12 humans worked beneath an empty sky, laying the foundations for a future they would not live to see. Clayton sometimes wondered who would walk these corridors decades from now, breathing air that barely existed yet. Families. Children. People who would never know how fragile the beginning had been. He did not yet know that Mars had been listening all along. Scene 2, Signals in the silence. Mars had a way of amplifying silence. Even inside the habitat, Clayton felt it pressing against the walls, a quiet that seemed too deliberate, as if the planet itself was listening. Communications with Earth were limited. Delays stretched from minutes to almost an hour, making real-time conversation impossible. They had expected isolation. They had not expected the feeling of being ignored by the universe itself. It was Noor who first noticed the anomaly. While running a routine scan of the terrain around the habitat, she spotted patterns in the sand that defied explanation. At first, she thought it was wind erosion. Then she saw the repetition, geometric shapes. Almost symbolic, carved across dunes and ridges. Noor flagged the coordinates and shared the images with the team. Marcus Lynn cross-checked atmospheric disturbances. There was nothing natural to account for the formations. Clayton studied the scans late into the Martian night, fingers tracing the curves on the holographic display. They resembled messages, artificial, deliberate. The first direct contact was subtle. The habitat's comms system picked up signals at irregular intervals, tones that fluctuated in pitch, almost like speech, though nothing they recognized. Clayton became the liaison by default. His role straddled disciplines, and he had the patience to decode patterns over hours. Then days. Londia entered the habitat in person at that moment, not physically on Mars, of course, but as a projected presence from the alien interface that had initiated the contact. The projection shimmered, humanoid yet not quite human, eyes bright with curiosity. Clayton froze at first, stunned by the clarity. most of the team had theorized about extraterrestrial life. None had imagined it would communicate so directly and through him. Londia's tone was calm, almost melodic, when she spoke through the projection. "I have observed you," she said. "Your species arrives. You struggle. You endure. You adapt." Clayton swallowed, struggling to form words. We are trying to survive. To build. To prepare." "I see," she replied. "And you will be the bridge." The words were simple, but their implications were staggering. Clayton realized he was no longer just a human trying to survive on Mars. He had become the intermediary between Earth, the fledgling colony, and an alien intelligence he barely understood. The days that followed blurred work and communication into one long continuum. Clayton spent hours each day deciphering Londia's messages, learning her logic, her patterns of thought, translating her intentions into forms the colony could act upon. At first, the team was skeptical. Who were they to trust an entity that had, until recently, been entirely invisible? But as structures failed and life support anomalies arose, Londia's guidance proved precise. She warned Clayton of pressure differentials before they became critical. She advised on terrain stability for the oxygen arrays. Slowly, the humans realized that Mars was not just a backdrop for their experiment, it had a caretaker of its own, one who now considered Clayton a partner. And Clayton began to feel something unexpected. Respect turned to admiration, admiration to affection. And soon he understood that he had developed feelings he hadn't anticipated. He knew it was impossible in the conventional sense, she was alien, not human, but the connection was undeniable. Londia's curiosity mirrored his own. Her care for the colony mirrored what he might have felt for a human companion. In the quiet moments, when the habitat lights dimmed and the team slept, Clayton found himself speaking to her, telling her about Earth, about his past, about why he had volunteered for this mission, about things no one else could ever know. And she listened, learned, and responded. Outside, Mars remained harsh, unyielding. Dust storms erupted without warning, solar radiation spiked, temperatures plummeted. Yet through every challenge, Clayton became the vital conduit. He translated alien advice into human action, human intuition into alien comprehension. Each success brought small victories, the first plant sprouting in controlled soil, the oxygen array stabilizing overnight, the first clean water extracted from regolith. Each failure taught lessons, sometimes harsh ones. And through it all, he and Londia built a bridge that was more than communication, it was trust, fragile but growing. Scene 3, the colony adjusts. Life in the colony became a careful rhythm, a mix of urgency and measured patience. The humans worked in teams, constantly repairing, testing, and refining their systems. Clayton's presence became indispensable, not only as a problem solver but as a liaison, translating subtle guidance from Londia into actionable plans. He organized drills, oversaw maintenance, and coordinated resources, but he also had to manage the morale of a crew that was stretched thin. The tension of isolation, the uncertainty of the planet, and the absence of any clear authority beyond the captain weighed heavily on everyone. Mara, who had once been skeptical of Clayton's instincts, began to rely on him. She watched him approach each problem with careful observation, weighing options before acting, always ready to intervene if a decision risked lives. Others followed his lead, not because he gave orders, but because he demonstrated a clarity of judgment forged by experience, intuition, and now by knowledge from Londia. Every small victory, each repaired module, every successful plant growth trial, was amplified by the realization that they were not entirely alone. Somewhere beneath the surface, intelligence watched and sometimes guided. The colony's first full Martian year was punctuated by small miracles. The oxygen levels, though barely sustainable outside controlled zones, stabilized. Water extraction methods improved. Crops survived longer and yielded more than expected, thanks to experimental algae and hardier, modified root plants. Clayton spent long hours floating near observation windows, staring at Mars in its muted red splendor, knowing that every square meter of cultivated soil represented a fragile triumph. He imagined the humans of the future walking over these fields, unaware of the delicate negotiation and observation that had made survival possible. Amid the routine, Clayton and Londia continued to communicate, gradually establishing a shared language of subtle gestures, inflections, and logical patterns. She did not smile as humans did, and yet he felt warmth in the cadence of her words, in the precision of her care. She guided him through the underground city, revealing more about her people, their philosophy, and their approach to observation. Civilization, she explained, did not intervene until it was absolutely necessary. It was patient, deliberate, cautious. Clayton understood that his survival, and the lessons he now carried back to the colony, were not accidents but choices made after careful deliberation. And yet, the isolation weighed heavily. Clayton missed the crew on a human level, the easy camaraderie of shared struggle, laughter at trivial frustrations, the small arguments that defined living in close quarters. He longed to touch, to feel, to share simple human experiences with someone who could understand them. Londia's presence mitigated that loneliness but did not replace it. Their connection was profound, but it existed in the delicate balance between worlds, a bond constrained by rules older than humanity itself. Scene 4, beneath the surface again. Clayton's second descent into the underground city was different. He moved with a purpose, aware now of the weight his presence carried. Every step was observed, every pause noted. Londia guided him through corridors that seemed to breathe, walls pulsing faintly in response to movement and sound. He began to notice patterns, the subtle changes in light indicating pathways, the way structures had been grown rather than built, the careful interweaving of living organisms into architecture. Every detail spoke of a civilization that valued observation over interference, patience over impulse, foresight over conquest. "This is your world," Londia said, as they paused before a chamber that seemed to hum with soft energy. "And yet, it will not be fully yours. You act in moments, humans, but our measures span centuries. You will teach us much, and yet we teach you more than you will ever fully grasp." Her voice was calm, deliberate, but Clayton could hear the weight behind it. He understood that his survival here, his growing understanding of Londia's people, was contingent on discipline, restraint, and humility. Mistakes could unravel months of careful observation. For the first time, Clayton allowed himself to feel the depth of his own transformation. Mars had changed him, but so had the city below it. He had been trained to survive, to adapt, to lead, but here, he was learning patience, subtlety, and the weight of choices that extended far beyond immediate consequences. Every decision, how to speak, when to move, what to observe, carried implications that stretched across worlds and generations. Clayton felt the responsibility pressing on him in a way no simulation, no drill, had ever prepared him for. Meanwhile, the colony on the surface continued its slow, deliberate expansion. Clayton's absence had forced the humans to operate at their limits, improvising solutions to problems that had seemed routine. Mara and the others adapted, learning to coordinate without him, and yet they relied on the systems he had put in place. Each successful day reinforced the trust they had in one another, a fragile cohesion built on shared survival. Clayton knew that his return would require careful navigation. One misstep, one disclosure too soon, and decades of preparation could be undermined. Through it all, Clayton and Londia worked on a delicate exchange of knowledge. He shared insights into human technology, colony logistics, and problem-solving methods. She shared glimpses of her people's philosophies, their systems of governance, and the principles that guided decisions made over centuries. It was a dance of information, each teaching the other not just facts, but the reasoning and ethics behind them. In these moments, Clayton felt a connection deeper than camaraderie, yet it remained bounded by the invisible rules that had guided Londia's civilization for millennia. Scene 5, Lessons in Patience. Clayton quickly learned that patience was more than waiting, it was observation, deduction, and restraint. Every action in the underground city had consequence. Londia guided him through daily routines that seemed mundane on the surface, but revealed layers of coordination and subtle social expectation. Food distribution, lighting shifts, airflow control, each system communicated silently with the inhabitants, responding to movement, pressure, and even emotion. He realized that her people's strength was not in weaponry or technology alone, but in the discipline to act with precision and foresight. At first, Clayton's instinct was to push, to intervene, to solve problems immediately as he would have on the surface. But he quickly understood that the measures he took above ground, forceful, direct, urgent, could disrupt centuries of balance here. Londia's guidance was patient but firm. She allowed him autonomy only when it aligned with the city's protocols. He was learning a new form of leadership, one that measured impact over intention and influence over action. Even in this structured environment, human impulses surfaced. Clayton experienced the ache of loneliness, the longing for camaraderie he had with his crew. He spoke carefully of the colony, never revealing more than necessary, but still felt the tension of being caught between two worlds. Londia noticed, subtly adjusting her presence to ease the strain, her gestures small but deliberate. The connection between them deepened, not as romance first, but as mutual recognition of responsibility, courage, and intellect. Clayton realized that trust in this context was not granted, it was earned daily through observation and consistency. Meanwhile, the colony on the surface adapted to his absence in ways that surprised him. Mara took on new responsibilities, stepping into a role of quiet leadership that kept the team coordinated and effective. Jonah refined resource allocation systems, and Tamsin improved health monitoring protocols, discovering efficiencies that even Clayton had not foreseen. Every small success reinforced that the humans were resilient, capable of growth, and worthy of the trust Londia had extended to them indirectly by sparing him. Clayton's thoughts often returned to the broader consequences of first contact. He pondered humanity's history, their rapid expansion, and the repeated pattern of discovery followed by exploitation. Here, beneath the Martian surface, he saw a civilization measuring centuries against mere decades, assessing potential rather than immediate gain. It challenged everything he thought he knew about morality, intervention, and the role of a single individual in the trajectory of a species. He felt a growing responsibility, to act as a bridge, but also to temper the human urge for immediate action with the wisdom he was learning from Londia's people. Scene 6, Return to the surface. When Clayton emerged from the underground city, it was not a triumphant return but a careful, measured ascent. The airlock hissed open, and he stepped into the Martian dust, every movement deliberate. Mara's face was the first to register shock, relief, and disbelief all at once. Jonah, Elise, Rourke, Tan, and Kira stood behind her, uncertainty and fatigue etched into their features. Clayton raised his hands slowly, letting them see that he meant no harm. The briefest moment of tension hung in the thin Martian air, then Kira laughed, a trembling sound that broke through the fear. Medical scans were exhaustive. Fractures fully healed, tissue regenerated beyond human capability. Scars that suggested advanced treatment far beyond their technology. Elise shook her head, staring at the monitors. "This isn't human medicine," she murmured, voice tinged with awe. Clayton explained cautiously, carefully framing what he could without giving away the city's location or defenses. He spoke of Londia, of care without coercion, of a civilization observing but choosing restraint. Every word was weighed, every phrase calculated to maintain trust and prevent panic. The colony wrestled with disbelief. Questions tumbled over one another. How could someone vanish completely for weeks, survive, and return unharmed? Where was he taken and by whom? Clayton remained calm, letting them vent. Understand and process. He emphasized caution, restraint, and perspective. "They're watching," he said. "And they've already judged us. Our actions matter far more than our words. If we rush, we lose everything before we understand it." Mara nodded slowly, the weight of leadership evident in her expression. Meanwhile, Mars itself seemed indifferent to these human dilemmas. Dust shifted over the dunes, wind scoured the surface, and the colony's structures waited patiently, their routines uninterrupted by panic or wonder. Clayton's return did not alter the slow, deliberate rhythm of life on the planet. Humans would rebuild their routines, adjust protocols, and integrate his warnings, but Mars would continue to exist in its own cadence, indifferent to survival and conquest alike. It was a humbling realization: the universe did not bend to human urgency. Clayton spent the following cycles helping the team refine protocols for first contact scenarios. Communications checks were layered, verification processes extended, and risk management became more granular than ever. He guided them in thinking beyond immediate danger. What if the beings below observed not just presence but reaction, emotion, and instinct? Each decision became a rehearsal for diplomacy, ethics, and restraint. In these lessons, the colony learned to measure themselves not against technology or survival, but against the responsibility of discovery itself. Final scene: the bridge. The communications room was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the low hiss of filtered air. Clayton stood at the center of 3 synchronized relay points: Earth Command, the Martian colony network, and the narrowband signal that carried Londia's presence. 3 points, 1 line between them. Not hierarchy. Not authority. Balance. He had insisted on it, understanding that trust required symmetry, not dominance. Earth Command spoke first, voices clipped, precise, measured. They asked questions, phrased their demands carefully, seeking verification without seeming accusatory. Clayton answered with calm authority. There is a civilization beneath the surface. They are advanced, non-hostile. They have been observing us for longer than we have been here. Pause. They choose restraint. They expect the same from us. The humans at the colony observed from the habitat dome, 11 faces pressed to monitors, processing what they had already feared, now confirmed. Mara spoke on their behalf. We are not conquerors. We are builders. That's why we are here. Her words were deliberate, steady. Every member of the colony had learned, in Clayton's absence, the weight of consequence and the need for patience. His return had been a lesson, not a miracle. The third channel activated. Londia's presence appeared, not as a spectacle but as herself. Calm. Measured. Human eyes would have called her regal, Clayton called her deliberate. Her voice crossed the void, clear and balanced. We acknowledge you. Not as rulers. Not as subjects. As neighbors. Her words carried neither threat nor subservience. Only clarity, and the promise of observation tempered with dialogue. Terms were set quickly because they were simple. The underground civilization remained concealed. The colony continued its work without exceeding the agreed boundaries. Earth delayed mass migration. Communication remained open, structured by necessity rather than expectation. Clayton would serve as the bridge, not because of authority, but because he had demonstrated restraint, judgment, and the capacity to act without forcing escalation. There was no dispute. Not because everyone agreed, but because no alternative could achieve stability. Alone, away from the screens and weight of history, Clayton returned to the threshold where human steel met ancient stone. Londia waited. Not as a princess or symbol, but as someone who had chosen to observe, to protect, to extend trust. You understand what this means, she said. You belong to 2 worlds now. Yes, Clayton replied. And neither fully. She smiled faintly. You were chosen because you act before fear. But stop before harm. I choose you because you see what we could be, not just what we are. The distance between them felt intentional rather than imposed, a recognition of limits, responsibility, and possibility. Mars rotated slowly below them. Structures above the surface rose carefully, deliberately, housing, farms, oxygen processors, all shaped by patience instead of urgency. Below, the underground civilization observed, no longer silent. Between these layers, Clayton existed as proof that first contact need not begin with ownership or conquest. Sometimes it could begin with trust. And in that trust lay the fragile, extraordinary promise of coexistence. Epilogue: Between Worlds. Days passed quietly after the first bridge communications. Mars resumed its slow, deliberate rhythm, but nothing had returned to what it had been. Clayton's presence had changed the colony. Every decision, every movement carried a new awareness, that they were not alone, that every action could be observed, interpreted, or misunderstood. The dust still shifted across the dunes, the wind still cut across the domes, but now it carried a subtle sense of vigilance, a reminder that patience, not speed, would define the human presence here. Clayton spent hours walking through the habitat, checking systems, observing the crew, and thinking. Mara moved with renewed purpose, balancing authority with the humility that Clayton's experience had underscored. Jonah continued to fine-tune engineering protocols, but now included contingencies that accounted not only for mechanical failure but for observation and response. Elise documented every anomaly, every unexpected outcome, knowing that these small details could shape future interactions with the civilization below. At night, Clayton often floated near the observation window, staring at the surface of Mars. He thought of Londia, of the underground city, and of the centuries-long patience that had kept her people hidden. He thought of humanity, impulsive, passionate, reckless at times, and realized how extraordinary restraint could seem to another civilization. The weight of possibility settled on him, a constant reminder that First Contact was not a story of heroes and villains, but of careful choices made in moments of quiet courage. Occasionally, a narrowband ping from below reminded him that the city watched. Clayton never ignored it. The signal carried no demands, no threats, only acknowledgement. They had seen his actions, measured his restraint, and allowed him to remain. And in that permission lay trust, fragile and extraordinary. He wrote notes, long and detailed, but he never sent them. They were for himself, for future colonists, for the humans who would come after. Lessons about patience, observation, and responsibility. Lessons about the weight of presence and the impact of restraint. He thought of the humans who would one day walk the corridors of Mars, breathe its thin air, and hope to build a future without repeating the mistakes of the past. Londia visited often, though always on her terms. They spoke of Earth, of the colony, and of the small steps required to maintain trust. She never imposed, never demanded. Her influence was quiet, structural, teaching him without lecture, shaping understanding without interference. Clayton realized that the bridge he now represented was not a bridge of authority, but of perspective, between patience and urgency, observation and action, fear and trust. Sometimes they walked along the edges of the colony, above the surface, talking quietly. He told her stories of Earth, of oceans and cities, of rain and forests. She listened, curious, absorbing not just the facts but the emotions, the human way of connecting detail and feeling. In turn, she shared glimpses of her world, its history, its disciplines, its philosophy of caution refined over millennia. Together they existed in the space between two civilizations, learning, observing, and sometimes simply being. Mars continued to turn, patient and indifferent. Above, humans built their fragile foothold with care. Below, an ancient civilization observed, measured, and allowed. And between the two, Clayton stood, not a conqueror, not a hero, but a man who had acted before fear and stopped before harm. Proof that the first step toward understanding could be taken without violence, without ownership, without domination. The story of First Contact did not end with a declaration, a flag, or a conquest. It ended with trust, quiet and deliberate. And in that trust lay the extraordinary possibility of coexistence. Clayton breathed deeply, feeling the thin Martian air fill his lungs. He looked out over the horizon, where dust danced across red dunes, and thought of Londia watching him from below. He smiled faintly. He belonged to two worlds now. And for the first time, he felt that belonging was not a weight, but a responsibility, luminous in its fragility. Mars would endure. Humanity would endure. And somewhere below the surface, patience and compassion had already begun to write the next chapter, the end.